It really does taste like drinking jelly beans. What's up, everybody? DRJ here. Today I want to talk to you guys about user friendliness versus accessibility. So these are two terms that I guess in many ways you can see as two sides of the same coin, or at least on two opposite ends of the spectrum. I oftentimes see people using one term when they should be using another, or not understanding there's a difference between them at all. And so today I wanted to talk to you guys about the way that I see these terms and how they influence, I guess, or how they impact the games we play today. So accessibility, the easiest way to define that is to look at something like COD and look at the whole idea of skill ceilings and limiting any one person's potential. As I've said many times before, one of the reasons why COD is popular is because, you know, it took out the frustration, I guess, of coming up against players that are better than you, because it makes it very, very difficult for any one player to consistently succeed and rise above all the rest. What happens is, you know, basically it through a number of different variables, things like, you know, radar, map design, it makes it difficult for any one player to, like I said, consistently capitalize and be the best of the best. And the differences at the end of the day between a player who is, you know, thought to be exceptionally good and a player who is thought to be average there's a very, 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 very tiny difference there. User friendliness is something that is found in many different games as well. I think a great example of this, and this is something that is just going to be start all sorts of controversy, is basically World of Warcraft. So World of Warcraft has been around for a long time. I was there from day one, and this is, I guess to me, this is the easiest way to define something like user friendliness that borders on accessibility. Early on World of Warcraft, you had basically, you could do dungeons or you could do raiding. And there was this magnificent leap in difficulty going from dungeons to raiding. What happened was that after a certain amount of time had passed, especially when the new content started coming out, there was no ladder of progression like there is today. There was no doing heroics to get badges to buy like old school gear to help you progress, and as a result have a chance of being accepted into somebody's raid group. What ended up happening is the only way that you were able to get into a dungeon was if you knew a guy that knew a guy who was friends with somebody who, you know, called in a favor. So what happens, what was really funny, is they instituted this ladder progression basically, I mean, years ago, justice points, and, you know, you can do heroics and things like that, which are, you know, more difficult versions of a regular dungeon, and it gives you gear which enables you to step up into that raid. The reason why this came about is, I mean, it seemed pretty logical to me. First of all, getting gear out of normal dungeons, at least back in vanilla, was extraordinarily difficult, and dungeons were really, really long and very, very tough for people to do. It was hours and hours of work, and, you know, frequently, depending on the classes you were, you know, you didn't get a spot in them anyway, so very, very tough. Not to mention you didn't have the whole looking for group thing or anything like that either. Servers weren't merged, lots of crazy different stuff. But what happened was, like, when you had raid, let's just say raid 1 content came out, right? When raid 2 content came out, because if you didn't raid in the first content, raid 1, there was no way to get to raid 2 because the best gear you could obtain was dungeon gear. So as much of a leap as there was between dungeon and raid 1, there's that much of a bigger gap between dungeon now and raid 2, because raid 2 is predicated on the idea that everyone there is going to be using raid 1 gear. This is what led to the whole idea of this ladder progression, justice points, etc. What's funny is that the community at large, well, many of these people seem to think that this was making the game accessible, which was something more akin to COD, where they thought that it was, you know, making it Care Bear or generalizing it or doing all sorts of things that they thought were killing it. But then if you looked at the rates of actual people just like walking into instances, let alone completing them, I think by the time like Naxxramas came out, something like 4% of the entire population of WoW, which at the time was closer to 12 million people, something like 4% had even stepped foot inside the instance. So it was really interesting to see the reaction the community to this whole idea of ladder of progression, because they thought it was, like I said, making it very accessible, dumbing it down to such an extent that now anybody can raid and anybody can do this. While there's definitely all sorts of issues relating to, say, the visuals of gear, people visually looking, closer to the raid type gear that people have. Back in vanilla, basically, you had 95% of the population walking around in blues and greens, and that very, very, very small percentage that was actually able to raid in those 40-mans were a fucking nightmare. Looked like a total ball banger, like you were dressed, it was obvious who was a raider and who was crushing people. Battlegrounds were just a total shit show. The guys who were raiding and had good gear used to just walk in and just massacre people. It was, complete bedlam. And the downside of that, though, is, like I said, number one, it's not an issue of accessibility, because I feel like it was a very much so needed part in order to get more people to participate. And just because you have the ability to now raid doesn't mean that the game is accessible. I feel like that is like the definition of not only user friendliness, but when you look at your content, and if you have 95% of the people unable, 96% of the people unable to do something, even setting foot inside it, something is obviously wrong. And the percentage of people that actually adversely reacted to hearing like this ladder of progression was going in was far more than the 4% that were actually even setting foot inside those instances and raiding. So it was really interesting. It's sort of, people picking up what everyone else are doing and just sort of shouting and yelling and throwing sticks because that's what their friend or neighbor was doing. I don't want to get too much into WoW because, sort of a discussion and thought on itself, but there are a lot of ways to make a game user-friendly without necessarily infringing upon the idea of accessibility. Other ways of looking at something like user-friendliness would be why consoles are popular in general. Consoles are popular because they have, they're cheaper, they all use the same standard, software developers kit, they all use the same hardware. That means that like your logistical issues are few and far between. Getting people, together in a party, setting up voice chat, just having your games run smoothly, even things like recording. These are so much easier to do on consoles. That means they're far more user-friendly. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're more accessible. Like I said, accessibility is dumbing a game's skill level down so that any one person basically can, like I said, play the game and be king for a day. And like I said, the difference between any player, any great player, and any good player or any average player is very, very small, whereas maybe 10 years ago it was huge. And what happened is, like I said, I mentioned this several times before, is that a lot of people didn't like that. They, players that weren't good or that weren't great or that weren't stellar were really frustrated. And it was actually interesting because there were fewer variables in games back in the day, and it was that much more frustrating when, when there just wasn't anything they could do to overcome their obvious skill gaps, the gaps between somebody that was, average and somebody that was amazing. You basically had, one gun in each side, there wasn't 4 billion different guns to choose from. It was very, very obvious who was a good player and who wasn't a good player. And when so much of what contributes to any one person's skill level is, fundamentals such as like positioning and map movement and map reading and strafing and using of cover, aiming, quickness, balancing out, defensiveness versus aggression. These are things that, these are fundamental variables that are, I feel like, core mechanics to FPS gameplay. And when you have one player who excels at things like these and other players that do not, it's really, really frustrating because they're things that can't be taught overnight. They're things that, maybe you come through experience, or things that one person is one person may be much better at than another, and they're things that people find themselves unable to overcome. And the answer to this sort of debacle is one of two things. It's either dumbing down something, which is where accessibility comes into play, so anybody can play it, or you can have ranking systems a la, Halo, to a lesser extent Left 4 Dead, things like that. But those are really hard to do because it takes into account a lot of different variables, and it's hard to match people up with appropriate skill levels. Anyway, that was a little long-winded. The crux of the argument here is just that user-friendliness does not necessarily equate to accessibility. They're two very different scenarios, very different arguments. Maybe at a future date I can go on and elaborate at length more on the whole discussion with WoW, because I think what happens with WoW is that the ladder progression is a great idea, but some of the things it ends up leading to with people appearing, visually appearing similar to one another, or even though there's different tiers of raiding, and where today you have raid finder the lowest, then you have regular raids, then you have heroic raids. So people are upset even when they're able to raid, even though they're not getting the same difficulty level, or even though the gear in heroics is significantly better than the other dungeon gear, or I'm sorry, the raid gear, they're still upset that people are like raiding at all. So like I said, the ladder of progression itself I think is a great idea, and if you're frustrated or upset with that, some of the things that it leads to, don't necessarily let that impact the way that you look at the idea, I guess, of the ladder progression in and of itself. Because if that wasn't in today, well, you'd have, imagine if you had, say, 10 tiers of raiding content, and each one of them was predicated upon the idea that your gear was based off the raid content before that. The percentages of people that would be raiding would continue to decline further and further and further as time goes on, which is why you need some type of ladder progression, which is, in my opinion, a great idea of user-friendliness and something that makes WoW, inadvertently more accessible. Not the same type of accessible as we're talking about, but it makes it more accessible to larger numbers of peoples, but the same accessibility, it is not the same type of accessibility that we're talking about when we reference something like COD, where anybody can be great any given round, and being good no longer means anything because most people are running around with negative KDs, and great players are running around with 3-to-1 KDs. So as always, comments, criticism, critiques, and let me know what you guys think.